One of the great injustices about climate change, at least for people living in the global north, is the public are not being told the truth about what we need to do to have a survivable future. So in this video, I'm going to look at it all the way through from what the scientists say, how the politicians get involved, what the media tell the public. If you haven't got time to watch the whole video, I can sum it up quite well by an extract of a speech by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and this is an extract from one of the most recent climate reports. It is a file of shame cataloguing the empty promises that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world. We're on a fast track to climate disaster. Some government and business leaders are saying one thing but doing another. Simply put, they are lying. Well, let's start with the science. We've known about climate change for 30 years, and during that time the response of the world's governments has always been, we don't need to change our lifestyles, we can just rely on new technology to allow us to live in a zero carbon economy, and we can rely on the markets to develop that new technology and to implement it at a global scale. Well, maybe 30 years ago that was true. The tipping points were hundreds of years away, or at least we thought they were. It was thought that maybe it was just impossible for planet Earth to warm by more than 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. In the last couple of years, it's become more apparent that the impacts of climate change are happening sooner than anticipated, and they're having a greater effect than the scientists thought. But still, we keep sticking to, we don't need to change our lifestyles, we can just rely on new technology. And the reason we can do that is because of something called integrated assessment models. Here is what Professor Kevin Anderson has to say about these models. For over 2 decades, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's work on cutting emissions, what experts call mitigation, has been dominated by a particular group of modelers who use huge computer models to simulate what may happen to emissions under different assumptions, primarily related to price and technology. And by price, I think he means the markets. I've raised concerns before about how this select cadre, almost entirely based in wealthy, high-emitting nations, has undermined the necessary scale of emission reductions. In my view, they have been as damaging to the agenda of cutting emissions as Exxon was in misleading the public about climate science. That is serious. The specialist modelling groups, referred to as Integrated Assessment Modelling, or IAMs, have successfully crowded out competing voices, reducing the task of mitigation to price-induced shifts in technology, some of the most important of which, like so-called negative emissions technologies, are barely out of the laboratory. 3 decades of complacency has meant technology on its own cannot now cut emissions fast enough. A second accompanying phase must be the rapid reduction of energy and material consumption. So remember that last sentence. We must have a rapid reduction of energy and material consumption. 20 or 30 years ago, the scientists could have said quite truthfully, we think we can solve the world's problems with climate change by having new technology. The integrated assessment models are developed in the wealthy nations for their own benefit to allow us to carry on consuming, when all along the scientists, at least this scientist, knows we need to have a rapid reduction of energy and material consumption. And who is Professor Kevin Anderson? He's the Professor of Climate Science at Manchester University, which is in Britain, and Uppsala University, which is in Sweden. And at one time, he was the interim director of the Hadley Centre, so he's a respectable scientist. And some of the words I'm using here came from a talk he gave to senior members of the British government, including the government chief scientist. Okay, so he's a reliable source of information. How are the integrated assessment models used to allow us to carry on our level of consumption? Well, it's all down to net zero, which is just an accountancy process really. You have a spreadsheet, you put into the spreadsheet all the causes of CO2 or other greenhouse gases to be emitted into the atmosphere. You put them all down, and then you put in another column all the ways you're going to either stop that CO2 getting into the atmosphere, maybe using carbon capture and storage at the point of where the fossil fuels are burnt. Maybe you're going to plant trees. Maybe you're going to use the new negative emissions technologies to allow you to extract huge amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere. It doesn't matter whether they exist or not, as long as you can imagine them. You put it in your spreadsheet and everything's fine. It doesn't matter if you're going to fly today and you'll say you're going to plant trees now that will absorb that CO2 that your flight will cause. It will take maybe 100 years for that tree or those trees to reach maturity which is when they'll start to extract lots of CO2. They might not even reach maturity. They might be destroyed in a forest fire. They might not grow because of drought. And remember, we need to cut our emissions now, not in 100 years' time. It doesn't matter. It just goes into the spreadsheet. Everyone's happy. And net zero is a relatively new way to allow people in the global north to carry on with our lifestyles. In the previous United Nations assessment report, there were 24 mentions of net zero, and they're all to do with building of houses and passive houses and things like that. In the latest version of the United Nations, which is United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report number 6, Working Group 3, which is mitigation, and mitigation is the way scientists try to understand how we're going to stop climate change, stop the damage we're doing. In the latest report there are 936 mentions, and the countries that support it the most are those with the biggest carbon footprints and the most to lose by changing our consumption patterns. And the good thing about net zero is it's quite a vague idea, so everyone can support it. Environmentally concerned people, the big oil companies who stand to make a lot of money if they can produce technology that can extract the CO2 from the atmosphere, which their fossil fuels have put there. Problem is, the technology doesn't really exist at the moment, and even once it's developed, you need to roll it out on a global scale, pretty much on the size of the existing fossil fuel industry. At the moment, I think last year 7 million tonnes of CO2 were captured and stored. It's tiny compared to Britain alone. It emitted 400 million tonnes of CO2, so it's trivial. And it's not just me saying this. Here is a report from a United Nations committee that's looked into these things. Engineering-based removal activities are technologically and economically unproven, especially at scale, and pose unknown environmental and social risks. It doesn't matter though, as long as you can put them in your spreadsheet, that's all that matters. And Professor Anderson says, this just allows us to delay things. Delay and procrastination is like putting ExxonMobil in charge of your climate change debate. Not only that, but to go into the spreadsheet as a cause of greenhouse gas emissions, your science must be rock solid, and it must be accepted into the scientific consensus so that it can be accepted into the United Nations climate reports and go into the spreadsheet. So for example, if you have a concern that permafrost is melting and it's emitting lots of methane, or if you think wetlands are emitting more methane than is being accounted for, if you're concerned that a lot of CO2 and methane escapes are happening by accident and aren't really being accounted for, they don't go onto the spreadsheet. So whichever way you work it out, it's in the benefit of the high polluting countries. Then it gets worse because the politicians get involved. Every 7 or 8 years, the United Nations produces its assessment reports on climate change. They're thousands of pages long. There are 3 different working groups. Maybe it's about 6,000, 8,000, something like 8,000 pages long. For something that's unimportant to the media or to politicians, no one's going to read 6,000 or 8,000 pages. So what the United Nations does is it comes up with what's called a synthesis report. There are 2 parts of it. There's one part that's 80 pages long, 80 pages. And then, in case that's still too long for you, there's a second version called the Summary for Policymakers and Managers, and that's only 40 pages long, 40 pages long. That 40-page document looks to the media as though it's a scientific document. But really, it's a political document, because every line of that 40-page document has to be agreed by every member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Every country has a representative on the panel. There are 195 members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They all have to agree every line of it. Now, in practice, if a country refuses to agree a specific sentence, then the report could still be accepted, and they would just put a note saying this country hasn't accepted it. But the way it's meant to work is it's meant to rely on peer group pressure for everyone to sign up to ambitious targets so that we can have a survivable future. So far, at least if you disagree with the science, it's all public. Anyone can read the scientific analysis, any scientist can. If you disagree with it, it doesn't matter who you are or how many people disagree with it. If you can prove the science is wrong, that's all you need. So the science is all public. When it comes to this process, it's much more secretive. For some reason, the world's governments don't want you to know what changes they're making to the climate reports, unless it's leaked to the BBC and to other news agencies. The leak shows a number of countries and organisations arguing that the world does not need to reduce the use of fossil fuels as quickly as the current draft of the report recommends. An advisor to Saudi oil ministry demands phrases like the need for urgent and accelerated mitigation actions at all scales should be eliminated from the report. Well, that's not what Professor Kevin Anderson says, is it? One senior Australian government official rejects the conclusion that closing coal-fired power plants is necessary, even though ending the use of coal is one of the stated objectives of the COP26 conference. COP26 was in Glasgow a couple of years ago. A number of countries argue in favour of emerging and current expensive technologies designed to capture and permanently store carbon dioxide underground. Saudi Arabia, China, Australia and Japan, all big producers or users of fossil fuels, as well as the Organisation of Oil Producing Nations, OPEC, all support carbon capture and storage. I bet they do. It is claimed these CCS technologies could dramatically cut fossil fuel emissions from power plants and some industrial sectors. Saudi Arabia, the world's biggest oil exporter, requests the United Nations scientists delete their conclusion that the focus of decarbonisation efforts in the energy system sector needs to be rapidly shifting to zero carbon sources and actively phasing out fossil fuels. Remember that later on, that countries like Saudi Arabia think we can carry on burning fossil fuels as we are, and we just can capture it all from the atmosphere later on. And then a whole paragraph gets deleted. There is large ambiguity in the extent to which fossil fuels with CCS would be compatible with the 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius targets as set out in the Paris Agreement. Don't take my word for it. Here are the views of Professor Michael Mann. He's one of the world's most respected climate scientists, and he's the chap who coined the phrase the hockey stick graph. This is what he says. While low levels of carbon emissions could be offset with negative emissions technology by 2050, there is no room in such scenarios for substantive reliance on oil, gas or coal decades from now if we are to achieve the necessary reductions. This report that's being produced, the 40-page long synthesis report, is going to be used not just for the governments to agree to, but it's going to be like a big publicity campaign by the United Nations to get the world's media interested. Australia asked IPCC scientists to delete a reference to analysis of the role played by fossil fuel lobbyists in watering down action on climate in Australia and the US. OPEC also asked the IPCC to delete lobby activism, protecting rent-extracting business models, prevent political action. Can you see the irony there? The paragraph warning that lobbyists are having a detrimental effect on tackling climate change is deleted because of pressure from the lobbyists who are lobbying to prevent action on climate change. And you might think, there are 195 countries in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. How is it that the countries like Saudi Arabia, or the rich countries, or the countries that are high consumers of fossil fuels, how are they able to have such influence? Why doesn't everyone just refuse to agree the report? The problem is, the rich countries are very well resourced at these conferences. Professor Anderson says, a rich country will have whole teams of scientists, of lawyers, of diplomats. They'll stay in the best hotels. And he says, by comparison, for the poor countries, they're just sat round on beanbags. Here's an example of how Saudi Arabia operated. The Saudi Arabian delegation of at least 10 representatives pushed at several points for the weakening of messages on fossil fuels and the insertion of references to carbon capture and storage, touted by some as a remedy for fossil fuel use, but not yet proven to work at scale. 10 representatives, if the negotiations go on all night, it's quite easy for Saudi Arabia just to keep swapping in new diplomats who are fresh and ready to carry on with the negotiations. And remember, if there wasn't an agreed report, well then there would be nothing we could do. At least this way we've got some report agreed. If there was no report, well, Saudi Arabia would be free to carry on burning its fossil fuels as it liked, because there would be no one saying we need to reduce fossil fuels at all. Much material on these technologies has been introduced to justify the idea of net zero emissions that has little or no scientific basis. Any faint mention of the problems of materials needed for the energy transition, which are indispensable for developing renewable technology, batteries or electric cars, is missing from the summary, and that was present in the draft. It doesn't matter whether you can't build enough batteries for your electric cars, as long as you've got them in your net zero spreadsheet, that's all that matters. Also gone is the mention of participatory democracy as one of the main tools to unblock and accelerate a transition for which there is hardly any time left. Do you recognise participatory democracy? It's one of Extinction Rebellion's demands that we should have a citizens' assembly, and that way the public are more likely to act than by leaving it to the politicians. So in this way, Extinction Rebellion and the scientists are much more in line than the politicians. Then it goes on, the word degrowth is mentioned 28 times in the full report, compared to 0 in the summary for politicians. Well, degrowth, again, the idea that we need to live more sustainably, that we should reduce our consumption levels, that's something in line with Extinction Rebellion's philosophy. After the politicians have taken out all the information they don't want the public to know, the synthesis report is finally published. It was on the 20th of March 2023. Although it wasn't that prominent on the front pages of the newspapers, it seems to me that journalists have only read the shorter 40-page summary. They don't seem to be aware of what's in the thousands of pages of the proper science. They're just going on the science that's been heavily edited by the politicians. So, for example, in a previous video, we saw that the scientists are no longer confident at the rate of sea level rise, and so now they're warning that by the year 2100 we could have 2.3 metres of sea level rise. There's a 5% chance of that, and they recommend if it's your job to design sea defences, you should even plan for higher sea levels than that. In the Times it just says if we have high emissions it'll be 1 metre sea level rise, if we have medium emissions it'll be 50 centimetres. So they're just going on the summary. In Britain there's a newspaper called the Daily Mail that's famous for its climate denial and its general tabloid approach to the news. They didn't have anything on the front page, but inside they did have an article, and its title was "Climate Catastrophe Imminent, says the United Nations," and they put it on the bottom of page 19, right at the very bottom, under a much more important article for them about a row between neighbours. In Britain we have something called the Independent Press Standards Organisation, and the newspapers voluntarily belong to it, and it's because in the past the newspapers have got a bit of a reputation for not exactly being straight with the public and trying to stir up sensationalism. So now they all try and adhere to the standards. And rule number 1, if you're a member of IPSO, the press must take care not to publish inaccurate, misleading or distorted information or images, including headlines not supported by the text. They have to tell the truth. They have to report that, climate catastrophe is imminent, but they put it on the bottom page 19, and they give much more prominence to what they call comment pieces. So they can say, we're not publishing this as news, this is just someone's opinion, and we're saying it's a comment, so that's fine. And if you have a comment piece, then you can say, net zero is a Trojan horse for the total destruction of Western society. Well, it is, I agree with that, although not for the reasons this gentleman's writing, who I think would like us to burn more fossil fuels and not to have net zero as a target. I'm going to use a BBC article as an example of lots of problems which I think are in the media when it comes to reporting news. And I'm choosing this one not because it's any worse than any of the others, but the BBC, it should be a reliable source of information. It's a public service broadcaster. And before we read it though, I'm going to read out the 8 rules for if you're a journalist covering climate change that you ought to adhere to. And it's been put together by the European Broadcasting Union. They're famous because they're the people who run the Eurovision Song Contest. But every public service broadcaster in Europe is a member of this union, and if you think public service broadcasting sounds like some sort of socialist plot, even the United States of America has public service broadcasters, okay, so don't panic too much. Anyway, here are the rules they suggest you follow if you're reporting on climate change. Reports need to be knowledgeable and fact-driven, not quote-driven. Number 2, proactively explain rather than just report. Number 3, goalposts. You need to give the context of what's being reported. So if a politician says we're nearly on our climate targets, you have to say how far away they are and what that would mean in practice if we were to make them, so the public can understand what's being said. You mustn't talk down to the audience. And also, number 5, don't be neutral. Be an activist and avoid misinformation. So you might think, well, surely the BBC has to be impartial, but no, that's not the case. The BBC, for example, is against child abuse. It's against international terrorism. So it's okay for the BBC, and they're suggesting public service broadcasters, not to be neutral, to be activist. And they need to be knowledgeable, because businesses and governments will publish greenwash. And a journalist is only able to tell whether it's greenwash or a genuine positive story if they're knowledgeable about climate change. Number 6, climate affects every story. There's no point publishing an article about a protest about private jets and covering how damaging private jets are to the world one day, and then the next day publishing an article praising the glamour of private jets and telling us what a great boost to the economy it is, and then forgetting all about the climate impacts. Climate change affects every story, so everyone reporting on every story needs to be aware of climate change and have a good knowledge about it. Number 7, be positive, report solutions but not greenwash. You need to report solutions, otherwise people just get fed up all the time of being told the bad news. And number 8, you need to do all of the above to fulfill your mandate as a public service broadcaster. Okay, so keep those things in mind, and we'll go through this BBC article. Starts off on a good foot. UN climate report, scientists release survival guide to avert climate disaster. Well, here's the first thing I'm going to point out. Governments had previously agreed to act to avoid global temperature rises going above 1.5 degrees Celsius, but the world has already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius, and now experts say it is likely to breach 1.5 by the 2030s. Did you know the 1.5 degrees Celsius we have now is completely different to the 1.5 degrees Celsius we had for the 2015 climate agreement? In 2018, the United Nations said with high certainty that we could expect to go past 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming between about 2030 and 2050. 3 years later, 2021, the United Nations says we could expect to go past 1.5 degrees Celsius warming between 2020 and 2040, thereabouts, so 10 years earlier. And the reason was it was realised the world had already warmed more than previously thought. So we're going to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming earlier, not because the planet is warming more quickly, but because we're already further along than people thought. Although whichever 1.5 degrees Celsius you use, they still would have happened earlier. So they are happening a bit sooner than people thought, but not by that much. So I just want to throw that in there. Then we get to an interesting part. The report acknowledges that in addition to getting to net zero emissions as soon as possible, large-scale use of carbon dioxide removal technology will be needed. Certainly will be needed, but we shouldn't rely on it. Remember that? Remember Michael Mann's advice? The scientists say this is a realistic plan to bring the Earth's temperatures back under control and warming back to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Do you remember? It wasn't the scientists who said that. Remember Michael Mann's advice? While low levels of carbon emissions could be offset with negative emission technologies by 2050, there is no room in such scenarios for substantive reliance on oil, gas or coal decades from now if we are to achieve the necessary reductions. So that's what the scientists are saying. They're not saying that. The people who want carbon capture and storage and other negative emission technologies are countries like Saudi Arabia. And in fairness to the BBC, somebody there must have realised that, because they updated the article later on and they took out that sentence. So can you see what the Saudi Arabian delegation wants taken out or put in to the climate report gets reported by the media as science? The BBC should do better than that, really. And the problem is, as the guideline said, number 1, report needs to be knowledge and fact driven, not quote driven. All they're doing is reading from the reports. Somebody at the BBC should have realised that much early, shouldn't they? Certainly I hope a Count Everything viewer would have spotted that. So really, what is that? It's carelessness. They're not actually lying to the public, but we are being misled, aren't we? Now here's another interesting bit. The UN Secretary General is calling for countries to bring forward their plans for net zero by a decade. Leaders of developed countries must commit to reaching net zero as close as possible to 2040. We've got net zero, most countries have signed up to 2050. We need to bring it forward to 2040. Professor Kevin Anderson says the developed countries really need to be carbon neutral by 2031. That's quite soon. And even then, you'd only have a 50-50 chance of keeping below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But that, it gets reported. You'd think a journalist reading that would think, wow, that's a serious thing. And it's also, have you noticed, no government, certainly not Britain, is planning to bring its net zero forward by 10 years. That seems to get missed. The only quote you get from the government is, the UK is the world leader in working towards net zero, but we need to go further and faster, a spokesman said. So they're not explaining it from knowledge again, they're just reporting, aren't they? They're quote driven. Well, Professor Anderson says, if you take into account the changes in Britain's exports, imports, aviation and shipping, then it works out in the last 30 years we've reduced our emissions of greenhouse gases by somewhere between 15 and 20%, which sort of works out about 0.5% every year. That isn't leadership. And he points out that countries like Colombia and Costa Rica are climate leaders, not the United Kingdom. The BBC doesn't report that because the journalists are not knowledgeable enough, and they're written by their environmental journalists, are not knowledgeable enough to be able to report it. It's just quote driven, which the European Broadcasting Union says you shouldn't do. And it's not just Professor Anderson. Britain's government has an independent climate advisor called the Committee on Climate Change. They've accused the British government of wasting a decade in not making any progress at all in tackling climate change. If we aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius and achieve 1.6 degrees Celsius, that is still much better than saying it's too late and we are all doomed and I'm not even going to try. Well, I think you can say it's too late, but we're still going to try. But anyway, and who is it that said that? That is Dr. Frederica Otto. She's a climate scientist at Imperial College, and more importantly, she's part of the core writing team for some of the United Nations assessment reports on the climate, which are the reports I've been reading out to you quite conscientiously for the last couple of videos. So, she's a reliable scientist, but she's saying something completely different to Professor Anderson. We've got two climate scientists saying two different things. We've got Professor Anderson saying we need to be carbon neutral by 2031 in the global north if we're to have a survivable future and keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, which really we all know is impossible, isn't it? It's only how many, 24, 6, 7 years away. And we've got Dr. Frederica Otto saying maybe we'll go past 1.5, but it'll still only be 1.6 or something like that. Well, here's the United Nations' own report on whether we can keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius or not. It's from Assessment Report number 6, Working Group 3, which is mitigation, about how we're going to tackle climate change. Section B6, global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 associated with the implementation of nationally determined contributions. A nationally determined contribution is where each government voluntarily comes up with an amount of CO2 or greenhouse gases it's going to reduce. Nationally determined contributions announced prior to COP26 will make it likely that warming will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius during the 21st century. Likely limiting warming to below 2 degrees Celsius would then rely on rapid acceleration of mitigation efforts after 2030. Professor Anderson explains it like this: every month we use up 1% of our carbon budget for keeping below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So 12% a year, 8 years, 96%. The problem is there's no country in the world is offering to greatly reduce its carbon emissions by more than the commitments they've already made. And so here the United Nations says by 2030 we won't have reduced enough. So that means from 2030 onwards, hopefully there'll be new technology or new governments that will be prepared to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. If we start then after 2030, then we still need to make drastic cuts. and that's far from clear. But it's worse than that, because it goes on to say policies implemented by the end of 2020 are projected to result in higher global greenhouse gas emissions than those implied by the NDCs. The NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are not good enough, and the policies for implementing them are even worse. As one of the assessment report authors, Dr. Otto could have actually written that paragraph, and in any case, even if she hadn't, she must have known what the report says about 1.5 to be talking about it in public. So why is it that she knows one thing from the report, but is saying something completely different in public? But it's not just Dr. Frederica Otto who's saying these radical things, that there is a realistic prospect of keeping to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which seems impossible. Here's Antonio Guterres, and he's being interviewed by Justin Rowlett, who's a BBC correspondent. And Justin sums up quite well the position that the world seems to think it's in with 1.5 degrees Celsius, and he's saying how difficult it is. But then the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, comes back with a very telling reply. There's the mantra, keep 1.5 alive. Currently we're on track for 2.4 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. China and some G20 countries are suggesting the 1.5 degrees Celsius target isn't achievable. Maybe we should drop it as a target. Scientists are saying something similar. Professor Anderson is saying exactly that. Saying the truth is, we've already passed it. You said we need to be honest about the climate issue. Should we be honest and say, actually, we've missed 1.5, and whatever that means, we need to be honest and set a new target? So that sums up quite well everyone's concerns about 1.5 and about how unrealistic it seems now. And Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, responds, that is not to be honest. That is to distort the present reality. The present reality is 1.5 degrees Celsius is still possible. If the global north can be carbon neutral by the year 2031, there's a 50-50 chance of being possible. 1.5 requires to be possible a number of things that need to be done. Let's concentrate on making those things done. So strictly speaking, he's not lying there. There are some things that need to be done to keep to 1.5. But is he being entirely straight with the public? Is he misleading them? He's telling the truth word by word, but are we being misled? And the answer is, I think we are being misled, but for a very good reason. Antonio Guterres is in a position of leadership. As the Secretary General of the United Nations, it's his job to get countries to cooperate with each other, to reduce their carbon emissions so we have a survivable future. It must be the most difficult job in the world. Can you imagine the stress and worry of being the person responsible for making sure we avoid a collapse of our global modern economy, a collapse of our modern societies, and the end of our modern civilization? Can you imagine what that must be like if it's your job to protect all of those things? In the same way as if you're climbing a mountain and it's very difficult and everyone wants to give up, if you're the leader, you don't necessarily want to tell everyone the truth, but you just have to be positive. Because if you're not positive, if you give up, then there is no chance of getting there at all. Finally, we've got to someone who's not being straight with the public. In fact, you might say he's not being entirely honest, but he's doing it, it seems to me, for the right reasons. Now, this is interesting because in a previous video I made about how a society collapses, I said, now we get to the stage where the governments will stop telling the public the truth because it won't really help matters. The government will just be desperate to try and keep it going. Remember, a civilization only collapses when the relationship between the public and the government breaks down. If the public lose confidence in the government, if the government tells people how serious things are and it's impossible, that would be the end of the relationship with the public. I'm surprised though, we've already got to that stage where it's impossible for the governments to tell the public the truth because it would just be too disheartening. It would just make things worse. But what it does mean is we've got two sets of people living in the same society. The people who read the climate change reports, watch Professor Kevin Anderson videos, make videos on YouTube about it, who have one view of what's happening and what needs to be done, and you have another group of people living in the same society with a completely different understanding because they're being told different things. It's going to be interesting how these things progress in the future with a sort of a segregated society. So that's the end of the video really. In the next video, we'll look at a bit more about the best thing to tell the public so as they don't give up hope but want to carry on trying, and that'll be a separate video. So thank you very much for watching. Feel free to leave a comment or to share the video, and I'll see you next time.